Hey YouTube, it's Frodan here to explain all the new comps, traits, and items that I've found that works really well on PBE so you can stomp your friends and get those bragging rights. I'm doing a quick overview of the best reroll, standard, and vertical compositions that have a diverse set of strategies and possible win conditions. The comp that I see doing consistently the best currently on PBE is Strategist. There's two different variations that you can play Strategist. It's around either Misfortune and Twisted Fate reroll and try to prioritize items for a dual carry, or to go for Azir as your primary and then build around the strategist afterwards. If you end up going for Misfortune and Twisted Fate, you end up going for a lot of like blue buff, Gunblade, and then probably like a lot of JG, for example, or even just straight up like death cap items so that you can get a lot of burst. And the same thing also applies to Azir as well. You could go ahead and just play like ramping things like Archangels or another Gunblade on him as well. It's pretty versatile. Because you have so much magic damage, you really want to have things like Magic Wand and Jeweled Lotus so you can really crit on those abilities. And also for things like Buried Treasures is really nice because that way you get a lot of items since it seems like you're going to be struggling to keep up with itemizing all your different carries. If you play the Misfortune Twisted Fate version, make sure that you also roll at level 6 or level 7. Level 6 is usually when you roll for because you have a lot of Twisted Fates and you want to maximize your odds. You might even be able to chase things like Nautilus 3 and Talia 3. And then like you're not going to be playing top end like this for a while. It'll be something kind of similar to this. So just keep in mind that there's a couple of different options and try to play it on the portal because sometimes that portal gives you that direction that you need. The only thing about positioning is just make sure that Misfortune is on the side that wants to take out shields because X marks the spot also destroys shields and prevents it. You want to put it in front of units like Shen, for example, who are really good at shielding and keeping the units alive. If you do get Strategist Heart, 5 Strategist is really strong and should definitely try to prioritize keeping that in and then flexing and adding things like Sharimans and other frontline later on. While I do emphasize things like magic damage and backline items, the most important thing is to keep your frontline alive with Nasus or Nautilus. If you do go Nautilus 3, it's possible that you end up moving your items to Nautilus instead and then giving Nasus just leftover items, like if you pick up like, you know, random things like Redemption and Vow and, you know, another Bramble. There's probably a variation of this that works with Double Trouble as well, so definitely give it a try if you have a spot for it. Rogue reroll is actually surprisingly really good, and the best part about it is how stable it is on 2 stars without hitting your 3 stars. It kind of depends a lot on the Ixtal variation. Ixtal is like the weather if you play Janna from set 8, where it changes from game to game. And so if Ixtal is electric, for example, you're actually trying to get to the backline and stun, and so that's actually quite good for the rogues because it adds CC on top of their abilities. I think wind also could potentially be really good if you want to use those hexes so you can get extra damage. Also, ice is pretty good for Nico. If you get Nico onto that ice hex, she ends up staying alive for quite some time. Augments like Idealism is fantastic because you want to itemize pretty much Idealism on everybody if you possibly can for a rogue so you can get that damage in. Rejuvenating Flames is really good, especially with Nico to keep her stable as your frontline anchor. And then don't forget that because you're rerolling a lot, you want things like Golden Ticket, for example, which can be really good so you can hit things like Katarina and Kiana. I did also 3-star Echo and Nico because these are units you do end up wanting to chase as your win condition. If you do hit Nico and Echo and you have all these 3-star, you can definitely win the game. In terms of the Noxus, the 2 best units you can hit are the most expensive ones, Mordekaiser and Scion. Also, this Milio is completely flex. This is only if you really feel like you have like 4 Ixtal, for example. 4 Ixtal variations can be quite strong. If you don't have 4 Ixtal, you can actually just cut Milio in the late game and just play somebody else. Play like a Heimerdinger, or you can even just play like another support unit. So you could just play like a random Jarvan. There's a lot of different things that you can do in the composition, so give it a try. In terms of positioning, the reason why I have it this way is because I kind of want all the rogues to be in the corners to jump. If I expand the full board and I click on these units, rogues tend to prioritize backline after they fall below 50% HP. So you end up having Kiana and Echo and Katarina dash towards the back corner a lot. And so it's actually really important that whoever's holding the items tries to stay on A1, A2, or A6, A7. And then once they dash, they all surround Nico, which is actually kind of good because Nico ends up trying to jump in and AoE, kind of similar to what Jarvan did when you give him that Chemtech explosion mod. A lot of people might be wondering, like, is there ever a time where you move things back in solo frontline Nico because she's really good in tanking and does a lot of damage? And the answer is probably not, because what ends up happening is Kiana and Graves would end up like walking up 1 while, let's just say, like an enemy melee unit just walks up here to try to tackle Nico. So because they end up walking here, a lot of times the dash is inconsistent and they end up only have a dash range of like the 2nd or 3rd row. The last thing I'll say, there are Graves reroll variations, but it's not really high emphasis on necessarily just rogue. And if you do, you end up wanting to play like a gunner, right? You talk about Gangplank, you can add that gunner connected to that Graves and potentially lean into it, but I haven't seen too many like vertical gunner, vertical rogue variations yet. If you do end up getting a rogue emblem, try to play it on Darius as well. Darius is quite good, and then you can cut Graves instead. Give rogue to Darius, and your board ends up looking kind of similar to what we did before, but you get Noxus online much quicker. Another thing that I want to point out is remember that if you put things like Spark on the Nico, you kind of want Echo and Katarina next to her. Sometimes when you're playing things like long distance pals, you end up like fragmenting your damage a little bit. So you have something like Echo and Katarina if you hit Echo 3, or let's say you have Kiana and Katarina on the opposite sides. Just make sure that the magic damage is all lined up around the Spark. The alternative is you could also put Spark on someone like Echo and then just put like another tank on him on Nico. So you can give her like, you know, a Stoneplate Gargoyle or a Redemption. Rek'Sai Quinn is a powerful duo now because Rek'Sai is a Slayer on top of a Void Bruiser, giving her extra healing and damage, which can be really clutch. And Quinn as a Slayer really backs up really nicely, particularly if you give her something like Last Whisper to shred for that Rek'Sai. Quinn also ends up holding 2 items a lot of the time because you want to give her the Demacia item. Right now, currently, the item that she gets is Deathblade. It's a Radiant. It might be a little bit too strong, so Riot might change that, but just play around whatever it ends up being in the future. Rek'Sai's best item is Gauge, which I think a lot of people have still yet to really play around, but part of the reason why it's really good is because if you end up leading to things like Bruisers, she gets that max 25 HP, which synergizes really well with the Bruisers because you get additional max HP. And so let's say you're not playing the Slayer version because you just can't hit Aatrox and you have 5, so you can just play, you know, Sejuani and Vi, for example. And this is totally a variation that you could play and also have a lot of success with. Make sure that you're rolling at 7 because you want to maximize your odds for 3 costs while having access to things like Sejuani and Mordekaiser, and potentially even hit things like Scion as a 1%. Augments that are really good are Slayer's Resolve because it basically gives you a Titans on the Rek'Sai. If you do end up getting things like Slayer's Resolve, you probably could end up just playing for more just raw damage items. So for example, you can go like Infinity Edge plus a Hand of Justice, which is a really strong crit build. Cybernetic Leech is like pretty good in general because most of your comp is melee and you really want to have a lot of healing on it. This comp ends up using a lot of swords. So if you have my sword, you can totally go for it. You know, Gauge, IE, GS. Don't forget that things like Unified Resistance can also be really, really good. And you can just move Mordekaiser to the back line. Mordekaiser items are also just kind of the extra stuff on top. A lot of times you end up playing, you know, like Thieves Gloves Mordekaiser and you go like, you know, Sunfire Redemption instead on a Bruiser. If you do play the Bruiser variation, you do really want things like the Sunfire Redemption so you can keep Rek'Sai alive. And instead of you have my sword, you want things like Titanic Strength. So that way you can get a lot of AD onto your front line. So give it a try, experiment around. And you also even notice that there's a couple of other flex spots. You can add a different Noxus. You can go for a different Freljord and things like that also can work. In terms of positioning, always make sure that Quinn and Rek'Sai are on the same side. So that way they shred for each other. Keep Scion towards the center. Jarvan here to stun the AoE clump. If you have QSS, you can even greed really hard and triple up. So that way Mordekaiser, Quinn, and Rek'Sai are all attacking the same units. Rek'Sai is more likely to get the reset with her dive. And that way you can go ahead and get access to the backline. This second batch of compositions is going to be focused on playing from like a traditional tempo win streak where you're playing from ahead and you want to focus on playing around a lot of 4 costs. The reason why you want to play this from tempo and win streak is because these are much stronger when you have high economy and you have a lot of time in order to hit. If you're playing loose streak and you're trying to, you know, go fast 7 and roll for the 4 costs, it's not guaranteed to hit, but you could try to play it from that spot as well. The first comp that we can talk about is Azir, Silco, and Juggernauts. This one was personally recommended to me by Ramblin', and Ramblin's a really strong AP player specialist who focuses a lot on how things work together cohesively. A lot of people don't know how to play around new Silco, but the reality is you just play him like as if he's Renata from set 6.5 Neon Knights, where you end up just making her as a support burn healer and racks up a ton of damage just by through the battle of attrition. So Silco's best in slot is Blue Buff, Morello, and Gunblade. He does so much AoE damage that it ends up having a lot of impact similar to Ahri. Juggernauts are a lot stronger this set because of the addition of Nautilus. Nautilus gives you so much mid-game anchoring and CC utility, so it's a ton of support that you can have. And Nasus is still the star of the show in terms of being itemized as a Juggernaut, but a lot of times you're going to be giving these items to Set or Nautilus early game while you kind of ramp up. Augments I want to shout out. Magic Wand because you just want so many Raws in this composition to get all that damage. You don't really do any physical. 2 Healthy ends up being kind of surprisingly good because it's basically Cybernetic Bulk without having to activate it since you're playing a lot of 2 costs like Swain, Warwick, and Set. And then things like Healing Orbs is really good because Azir and Silco are doing a lot of damage. When those units die, they heal your frontline with Juggernauts. Juggernauts have damage reduction, so the more flat health you have, that damage reduction scales based off more HP, so on and so forth. If you do end up getting to level 8 pretty safely, and you want to think about what unit to add, you can add in things like Aatrox, for example. You just cut Set here, and you just play Aatrox instead. Or if you're playing 2 healthy, you would cut Nautilus and play Set, so that way you get all the HP bonus. And then if you do really want even additional top end, you probably want to go for things like Ahri over Silco and just give her all those items. And then you can have her scale. This is something that you can play for level 9, for example. Another possibility is that you just cut Swain entirely, you play around Ari and Silco at the very top end, and your front line becomes something more like this. You go to level 9 and you just play like another legendary like Heimer or Scion. In terms of the Zon mods, the best one by far is Violent Bioware, because after you cast his ability, it deals more damage in that AoE. So it just has a lot of synergy with his Undercity tactics. That's really, really powerful for that AoE damage. If you don't have those, you probably could get away with playing like Adaptive Implant, but I wouldn't really recommend too much more besides that, because the mods don't really favor Silco. They're much better for someone like Warwick. Ionia Vanquisher is the new way to play vertical Ionia. You're not really playing around challengers very often because Yasuo is no longer in the set. Instead, you're playing around Xayah and giving her a ton of AD items. Her best AD items are things like Last Whisper Guardbreaker, because she hits so many different things and you get a bunch of crit, and Deathblade, so you can augment her damage. Remember that Vanquisher gives you the ability to critically strike. It's actually a lot like Assassin, so you don't actually need things like Infinity Edge and Jewel Gauntlet a lot of the times. This also applies to Jewel Lotus. You don't really want to pick Jewel Lotus when you're playing Vanquishers. A lot of times you want to play this composition from a tempo win streak, meaning that you want to try and play from ahead as much as you can, so that way you can go to level 8. In the end, if you can avoid skipping 7, that is actually the best way to play this comp, because you do want to roll for a bunch of the 4 costs, and you want to hit a 5 cost that can be really impactful, like a Aatrox or a Rise or a Heimerdinger. Heimerdinger hasn't really changed very much in terms of what you actually want to play around him, so I would just recommend a double burn plus shrink. I do want to say that one thing is that new shred has now moved down to 20 and 30%, which is a lot lower than it was before. And so if you do want to go for a double shrink plus a burn, I think that's completely acceptable as well. So that way you don't have to play like Last Whisper. Instead, you can go for Xayah items, like a Hand of Justice, for example, and keep your crit going. Eula's the best holder of Ionia emblem because she scales off of attack speed, and also you want to give her things like Rapid Fire Cannon for range. This is probably not even true BIS. Like, if you actually really want to go like guns blazing, go for double RFC or maybe even triple RFC. And for that reason, scope weapons is also quite good, because that you can have Neela in the back line, because Neela and Xayah with that range is actually really useful for them, and you can watch them pop off. Don't forget about Shen items as well. Shen items are very, very crucial to make sure your front line is stabilized, so that way you have an opportunity to tank a little bit of damage and let Neela and Xayah ramp up. And because you have a +1 Ionia, you end up cutting things like the Karma, for example, so that way you can play around better front line. You already have enough DPS anyways, and Karma is just pure DPS. If you're just not hitting Neela and you really need a different source of damage that can use the Ionia emblem pretty well, try Mordekaiser. Mordekaiser ends up scaling with attack speed really well, and he utilizes things like the scope weapons and RC. Fantastic. This also applies if you somehow get like a double spat. You can go things like Vanquisher, Mordekaiser, and you have scope weapons. Like, this build actually has a potential to really pop off, but it's pretty rare, so obviously you can't pull it off consistently. And of course, people might be wondering like, hey, is Bel'Veth still really good with Ionia emblem? Is Heimerdinger still really good with Ionia emblem? The answer is yes. You can also put it on Aatrox. These are all still fantastic users of it. The trait hasn't really fundamentally changed that much. The next section that we're covering is all the strong verticals that are currently doing well on PBE. Vertical is defined by stacking a trait higher and higher. So like a 2, 4, 6, 8 or a 3, 6, 9 trait. You just keep going higher and higher until you hit the prismatic trait version of it. Let's start off with Bilgewater. Bilgewater is pretty strong if you're able to get Gangplank in particular, and you have really good items around Misfortune and Neela. I always recommend that you try to pursue the vertical if you have the +1 emblem, because it's so much easier to hit and it's less conditional on whether or not you're able to hit all the perfect units. The other thing that I think is really fun to play if you don't have an emblem is Rising Infamy, because you get a treasure chest that scales and improves the longer the game goes, which is really fun and also gives you a higher chance of hitting things like that Gangplank. The two best Misfortune items is Blue Buff and Guardbreaker. Blue Buff is just naturally very good with the 50 mana that she has, so you want to have her cast pretty quickly and you want her to destroy shields. And Neela, as we talked about before, really scales off of things like the RFC. So in fact, this is another situation where you can go triple RFC on Neela, which ends up making that the legend that you can play with this is Twisted Fate, for example, so you can guarantee you have best in slot items. You can play Jarvan for Strategist a lot of times because Misfortune is the carry, so you kind of lean into her. But alternatively, you can also just play like any Vanquisher, for example, and try to synergize with Neela. So in this spot, for example, you can play a Darius, and you get Juggernaut on your Nautilus as well. Nautilus is really good as a 3-star, so you can go ahead and pursue him and Misfortune 3 as a possible way to win the game. So don't be afraid to just stay on 8, roll forever to look for Gangplank, pick up a bunch of Misfortunes and Nautilus, and just go from there. And the last thing I'll say is Long Distance Pals is pretty crazy in this composition if you end up having Misfortune 3 and Neela, or even when just having Gangplank and Misfortune. 9 Bilgewater is allegedly very good. I've only played it one time and I somehow like lost and got 4th. But everyone swears by the fact that the nearby enemies take 50% of cannonball damage is really good. So give it a try if you haven't already. The next vertical I want to talk about is Demacia. Really strong around Quinn and Fiora if you can get the Quinn 3 and play around her Slayer trait. A lot of times if you get a +1 emblem start, you have a really powerful early and mid game. And remember that Shred has been reduced in 9.5. Things like Last Whisper, Ionic Spark, you name it, now Sunder's less. This means that traits with resistances get better because they just get less reduction. So Demacia is a lot stronger now. Remember that Demacia gives you a radiant item, so you end up building 2 items each a lot of the times. So just go for like Last Whisper IE on Quinn. She gets Deathblade currently. If they move Deathblade, you could want to prioritize Deathblade on her. So let's say in the future, this ends up becoming, let's say in the future, they go back to Radiant Runons, then you want to probably just build things like Deathblade. Fiora's currently playing for Steric's Mega Shield. This is Fiora BIS, so try to make sure you have any variation of this. Also, if you somehow get Radiant Bloodthirster, let's say you're playing Radiant Relics, you definitely want to pursue Fiora and Demacia, even without a +1. Also, don't forget there's powerful synergy with things like Cybernetic Bulk on Demacia because you get so many free items that it's really easy to spread it out, and it combos very well with the resistances. This is the standard level 8 board, but if you do end up getting a +1 Slayer, you end up cutting Shen and you play around the Mordekaiser and the Aatrox instead. You can go for 4 Slayer. Usually you play around one or the other. Ideally, you play around Mordekaiser until you hit Aatrox because this is 9 units. If you do have a Slayer emblem, you can go for a +1 Slayer onto Fiora. Slayer gives you Omnivamp, so you can replace the Bloodthirster if you do get that on Fiora. The only thing I want to note is that Demacia does tend to position, but remember one thing is that Demacians do not stack if you position the elites next to each other. So if you do end up going 7 and you have 4 elites, you can go ahead and spread things out like, you know, say Galio is one of the chosen ones, and then Fiora is here buffing the Jarvan. You can just spread out kind of like this, for example. The last augment I want to shout out is anything to do with support items. So like support cash, for example, could be pretty good. This is because a lot of the support items tend to revolve around clumping up, and you do end up having a lot of synergy with support items that give you aura AoE benefits. Bastions are still very good, and they have a new flavor with now the option of either going for Aphelios or Silco as your backline. If you do end up playing around Aphelios, it's still the same thing, which is Rage Blade, Death Blade, and maybe even just another Rage Blade. But for Silco, you probably want to play it similar to how you play Renata Bruisers, again from 6.5, where you do Blue Buff, Morello, and Gunblade, and you have him stall out. And you have things like Ascension, Transfusion, the usual suspects to be really good for stalling out and ramping up your damage over time. The big reason why this comp has caught my eye is because of how strong the new Ixtal Rise is. Ixtal Rise scales off the amount of armor and magic resistance that you have, and Bastion gives you a ton, especially if you can get to 6 or even potentially 8. Make no mistake, 8 Bastion, Ixtal Rise is a legit win condition to take first in almost every lobby it plays in. If you do end up getting the Ixtal Rise, go for another mana item to help generate him to cast like a Shojin, a blue buff, whatever you can get. Important to note that Ixtal Rise is a 2 hex range unit, meaning that if you put him in the back line, he's going to walk up anyways and cast. So just put him in the front line so he can cast faster. Put him next to Taric so he has the ability to get multiple casts off with the shielding for Taric, or just put him next to Redemption so you can get the healing. In terms of positioning, just kind of keep, you know, these things back in the corner so that way they're away from AoE. And you can totally justify putting Poppy in instead. Let's say you get a Demacian item, you put Demacia instead, you play around 3 Demacia, you could totally do that too. This comp is pretty obnoxious. I actually beat a 3-star Azir with this composition and it wasn't even close. So yeah, I think this comp might actually get nerfed in the future because Ixtal Rise is like pretty OP right now. The next vertical to talk about is Noxus. Noxus is a little bit different than how it was in Runeterra Reforged 9.0 because you have different breakpoints of 3, 5, 7, 9 now. So at level 7, you end up rolling for the 7 Noxus units, basically what we have, and then you add in like a different unit like Aatrox to level 8, depending on when you're able to get to level 8. But you do want to chase the 3 stars for Darius 3 as well as Katarina 3. It's pretty similar to how it's played before, except now you have a 3rd carry potential with Mordekaiser, who can hold things anything from RFC QSS to random items like Crown Guard or even Thief's Gloves. And the augments are still kind of the same. You ideally have something like a +1 Noxus emblem, but I do want to give a shout out to things like Total Domination, which is really good for the execution. Cybernetic Leash because almost all your carries are within melee range. And then Know Your Enemy is still pretty good, especially if you're just playing like 5 Noxus instead of 7 and you're flexing around different traits, or you just want to get the extra bonus damage because you want to end fights quickly. You can also go for things like Idealism. There's a lot of augments that are very, very good for this comp. One thing about positioning I want to call out, which is the comp is actually pretty decisively split between AD and AP damage. With Katarina holding things like Spark, for example, or even potentially Swain, you want to keep Katarina and Mordekaiser pretty close to each other. And then for AD damage, you want Samira behind Darius. So just always make sure that these are lined up in this way. If you can't find Aatrox and you need another unit to splash in, always try to prioritize a little bit more frontline because you have so much damage. You just need to stall for them. So Sejuani is pretty good, for example. You can even play Shen because it links to Cassiopeia with Invoker. Or you can always just play Nasus or the Juggernaut. There's a lot of different options that you can have. Just make sure to try to play a little bit more frontline than backline. Last couple I want to talk about is Challengers, which is actually still really strong if you can get everything online. And it's often played from a tempo win streak position. Challengers, I think, are pretty underrated, but I think most people are not really playing around the new variations of Challengers. They're trying to force Ionia still as part of the core, but you don't really have Yasuo anymore, so it's hard to get that double Challenger, double Ionia. Therefore, you're supposed to play around Demacia a lot more, and you anchor around Fiora and Kai'Sa. If you're able to get things like a +1 start and hit 6 Challenger very quickly, you'll snowball the mid game and be able to get to level 8 quickly. And then play around Fiora, Kai'Sa, hit Jarvan, so you have 3 Demacia, and then watch Fiora pop off. The positioning here is, for one, social distancing, and two, how you can try to manipulate things to get Fiora buffed by both Aatrox and Naafiri. Darken bonuses are very good for Fiora in particular, so if you can find a way to get them onto her, she'll do a ton of damage. If you do get a Challenger emblem, it's really good still on Aatrox if you can get Challenger, but I also want to give a shout out to Mordekaiser, who's also very, very good if you can get a Challenger emblem on him. If you can somehow get to like 8 Challenger and get Mordekaiser in, you can win the game, because Mordekaiser 2 with attack speed, and you give him, say, an RFC and a Crown Guard or whatever, or QSS, you can actually have him pop off completely and he'll destroy a bunch of stuff. So this is a composition that I think is not as popular on PBE, but I believe in its potential in the top end, and it has a lot of flexibility with its itemization. So give it a try if you have an opportunity. So those are all my top compositions currently on set 9.5's PBE for Horizon Unbound. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, whether or not there's different optimizations or combos that you found. But remember, this is all subject to change because PBE is for experimenting and having a lot of fun. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.